Welcome to Feminism, Concepts and Theories, our third lecture for this week. In this lecture, we're going to continue with our queries regarding vocabulary, except we're doing something else this time around. We're going to use Bell Hooks' book, Feminism is for Everybody, in order to anchor our discussion. If you remember from last lecture, we did use a couple of concepts from the book in order to pepper our understanding of feminist vocabulary. So today we are doing something a little bit more ambitious. We're going to continue with feminist vocabulary, but we're going to use the book in order to be able to locate vocabulary in each of the chapters. So please pay careful attention. This is going to be one of the more important lectures for this week because we're going to read an entire book. And while reading it, I know the thought might be intimidating, we're going to continue focusing on concepts. So my goals are twofold. One, I want to be able to locate concepts in Feminism is for Everybody, and in the process, also be able to have a common understanding of how is it that we read something in particular relation to feminist theory. So let's get started. Please also remember that as we go along, there will be chapter by chapter learnings and conclusions, so I suggest that you guys take copious notes. Just to give you a little bit of a reminder, we went through this in the last lecture, but feminism is a system of ideas that examines the roots and reasons for women's subordination in relation to male or masculine privilege, and these terms will keep coming back, so just a little bit of a rehearsal. It's in tension with male-centered ideas and discourse, which means it's not against or for or any kind of very clear positions. It's about friction and tensions. It's about argumentation. It is an ideology, and I went over the ways in which I'm using ideology in relation to this lecture. Also a movement for socio-political change based on said ideology. Now this is also important to rehearse because keep in mind that Bell Hooks' book, Feminism is for Everybody, is not merely a theoretical intervention. It is rooted very, very clearly in the history of the feminist movement in the United States. It's also located in relation to the expansion of concepts in relation to such a location, meaning think of it as a dialectic. Something happens in society, it influences conceptualizations, conceptualizations influence movement and actions and behavior in society, and it keeps going. And not to say that this is a very clear division of labor, and that's why it's important for feminist theory, for us as students of feminist theory, to be rooted in the everyday. I will keep coming back to this. Again, lest I have underemphasized this before, it posits gender as the primary category of analysis. This is Bell Hooks' book, Feminism is for Everybody, Passionate Politics. Yeah? Keep this in mind. Please have it on hand as you go through the first week of lectures. Very, very important question. Who is Bell Hooks? Why is it that I've chosen this text as your introduction for feminist theory? Why not something a little bit more local or located? And the reasons are many, but let me first give you a bit of a biographical introduction to who Bell Hooks is. Bell Hooks is an American academic, professor, feminist, and social activist. The name Bell Hooks is borrowed from her great-grandmother, Belle Blair Hooks. Now, if you will notice, she uses small letters in her name. Now, this is important to remember because when you cite her, please make sure to reproduce her name in this fashion. And the reason she does this is to take away from similarity with her great-grandmother, of course, but also to emphasize that the work she does is far more important than the remembrance of her name. In other words, the author is only as important as her contributions and interventions, if not lesser. So, Bell Hooks, academic, professor, feminist, activist, and as you can see, this is interconnected work. What she teaches and talks about is also related to how she acts in the world. And this kind of attempted seamlessness between how we think about the world and its ways of behaving, conceptualizations must also influence directly the ways in which we are able to live in the world is a cornerstone of feminist theory. I've already gone over this beforehand, why bell hooks, but there's another thing to remember. Bell hooks is an interesting figure in herself, primarily also because of her removal from our local scenarios. As this class continues to move in the direction of theory, we must remember that it's not just about contemporary feminism. It's also about the ways in which we understand the larger feminist movement in various parts of the world. And for reasons that I do not want to go into right now, often theoretical production has been European, North American, or the global North specific, and we have read it in relation to that before trying to understand how is it that it works for us. So a large part of this is universal, a large part of this is particular, and you can choose what to take. This is an important set of terms to remember: intersectional feminism. Meaning, of course, gender is important in the world, but gender also matters in relation to other categories of identity, and therefore, bell hooks, like many others, is an intersectional feminist, meaning she understands gender to be one of the important forces in the world, influenced by all other forces at the same time. Meaning, any kind of impact that we assess cannot isolate gender. 2. Bell hooks is a public figure, and I cannot overemphasize the role of public feminism. Feminist theory is not meant just for academia. It's meant to guide our actions in the world. It's meant to intervene in how is it that the patriarchy is constructed. And therefore, it's important for us, for this class, for theory, to engage with public feminism and what it says in the world. We'll keep coming back to this, especially in relation to feminism and popular culture, but for now, these are some of the reasons why I thought we should start off reading bell hooks. Let's start with the first chapter. The first chapter, Feminist Politics, after the introduction, goes straight to the heart of the matter and speaks about the rise of a particular kind of feminist organizing in the United States. Let's engage briefly with one of the most important concepts in this chapter, which is that of consciousness raising. Now, consciousness raising presupposes a couple of things. One, that in many ways, none of us would deny the fact that we want to live an equal life. It just matters differently to different people in terms of how they understand such equality. So consciousness raising for feminist politics in the US was a form of mobilization of women to say, while you think that your lives are all right, while none of this might seem particularly egregious to you, perhaps together we can start paying attention to the small ways in which inequality is perpetuated through and in a patriarchal system. So sometimes it consisted of extremely homegrown activities like meetings in people's backyards where they got together to read popular texts, to be able to exchange their everyday experiences and share the ways in which they understood the terms of gender equality or inequality. And you can see how this is a collective ethic, because here you're looking at consciousness raising as if there's a collective kind of fervor, that together we must take everybody with us in order for the feminist movement to have any kind of import in the world. So there is a revolutionary fervor to it. There is a certain kind of, what is the term for it? There's a way in which you're converting people to a cause that you think is worthy. We'll talk about the problems of this later on, especially in the weeks when I'm discussing the 3 waves of feminism. But for now, it's important to be able to register that there was a certain kind of collective feeling. There was an excitement in the air. It's the kind of excitement one can imagine when suddenly a community of people speaks about feeling something together. It can be tremendously transformational. It can be remarkably assuring for people who feel that their feelings are lonely feelings, that only you have felt like you're discriminated against in the world, and actually you may not be borne out. Suddenly, in this particular point of the movement, there came a collective of women who said, you're not alone, I feel the same way, we all should do something. And this is important to understand the next set of terms in this chapter, which is about revolutionary and reformist feminists. Now, the terms are giveaways. What is a revolutionary feminist? What is a reformist feminist? And you come against this binary, you come up against this binary in other political scenarios too. People who want change can be revolutionary, they can be reformist, right? Revolutionary feminists understood the entire system as corrupt, as there being a constitutive basic problem that can only be resolved if we uproot the whole thing, which means a revolution has to come for there to be substantive change. So there's revolutionary feminism. Reformist feminists, on the other hand, spoke about small changes. They said, surely society is a bit unwieldy. The world is an unwieldy entity over which we do not have that much control, and honestly, a large part of it works. So why is it that one must uproot it entirely, right? So reformist feminism is about the understanding that small changes will add up. The change comes about not in an exponential, but in an incremental fashion. Little here, little there, and slowly, before you know it, everything has changed. In this class, we're not debating which is better. There is no particular tendency that I want you all to head towards, which is either revolutionary or reform. You are free to think in any way you choose, but these are the kinds of assumptions that undergird these forms of politics. So in this chapter, Hooke speaks about the differences between these kinds of feminists, but also locates these tendencies in white supremacy. Now remember, Bell Hooks is talking about feminism in the United States, which experienced a certain amount of change in relation to the understanding that early feminist interventions had to do with the demands and the needs and the feelings of white women, of Caucasian women, of women who, in terms of race and class, experienced certain kinds of privileges that were not available to African American women. And therefore, the revolutionary feminists said that reformist feminism only addresses the needs of white feminists. What about us? And for our needs to be addressed, there have to be bigger changes in society than a mere tweaking of things here and there. Therefore, white supremacy, or the idea that there is an understanding of who counts as superior or naturally deserving or entitled in American society, has to do with race, is what undergirds this term. We'll come back to it a little later on in the chapter on race and gender. And lastly, this is Hooke's term for what she calls lifestyle feminism. But now, lifestyle feminism should strike you by its very term as something that Hooke doesn't like. She is not suggesting that we adopt lifestyle feminism. In fact, she is critiquing it soundly, saying lifestyle feminism is what takes away from the possibilities of the feminist movement. Because lifestyle feminism tells you that you're free to be feminist in any way you want and societal change is not required. So you like being feminist by asking for a raise in salary, go for it. You like being feminist by asking that your partner share your cooking duties, go for it. And besides that, nobody ever need expand this into other understandings that will allow every woman to be liberated in a similar fashion. She decries and critiques soundly the selfish understanding that only allows for the needs of a certain set of women to be fulfilled. And to give you an example of such lifestyle feminism, closer home, let's take a quick peek at such an example of lifestyle feminism. Anybody remember this video that caused such a ruckus on Indian social media? It was Deepika Padukone's Vogue Empower. It's my choice. Now break down the words used in this. There are clear kinds of signals as to how is it that one must consume this video. Empower, it's my choice, right? Empowerment comes through making choices. The video allowed for viewers to think that empowerment is possible as long as you make a choice, and in fact it was a plea arguing that all of women's choices are both valid and allowable in our society, and that is the true meaning of empowerment. Think a little bit about why this would qualify as lifestyle feminism and the ways in which this might be subject to critique by bell hooks. For one, it does not represent all kinds of women in society, it's a set of celebrity women. Yes? Two, this idea of choice itself has got so much to do with market economy, meaning within a set of choices, choose. Don't have to employ any imagination. As long as you make that choice, you're an empowered woman. And lastly, it completely negates and neglects the factors that do not allow for women to make choices, the kinds of obstacles that prevent them from being choosing subjects in the world, be they family, state, society, opinion, upbringing, acculturation, what have you. So in many ways, the video came across as rather naive by saying that just by declaring something as choice does not make it either empowerment or liberation. Consciousness raising. Moving on to the term that we introduced in the last chapter, this was based upon this understanding that feminists are made, not born, right? Which means that feminism itself is a particular subject position that one has to come to. It is not something that is waiting to emerge automatically. There is an education and a mobilization involved in bringing together the feminist movement, something that I gestured to also in relation to the last chapter, right? Consciousness raising sessions which I spoke about were modeled like AA meetings. And for those who don't know, AA meetings are Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, which hope to bring together the community in order that people can support each other in overcoming addiction. Now clearly, feminism is not seeking to overcome any kind of addiction except to patriarchy, but in that model, community is important, inclusion is important, kindness towards one another, understanding of one another, giving a patient ear to one another are the principles upon which these consciousness raising sessions were modeled. Also important to remember is that these sessions offered the message of feminist thinking to everyone, irrespective of class, race or gender. And these again have to do with the principle of inclusion that I was referring to, meaning the only thing one has to have in common is a curiosity and an orientation towards bringing a certain kind of feminist change in society. The idea and the goal was to bring about a feminist thinking, and therefore one needed to clarify the collective nature of patriarchal domination, meaning patriarchal domination exerts itself upon all of us singly and together in one fashion or the other. It is the basis of our current society. And very important, men were considered allies in this endeavor. If men cannot quite understand the experiences that women faced on account of not being women, they could still be allied in the project for feminist revolution or reform, as the case may be, because surely one can understand inequality even if one doesn't experience it on their own. Our next chapter, Sisterhood is Still Powerful, brings to light another important concept, the idea of sisterhood, which follows from the idea of community itself. And here the endeavor that Hooks is speaking about is in combating internalized sexism. Now, what does internalized sexism mean? It means that in many ways we are not producing a victim-perpetrator equation. We're not talking about women as perpetual victims and men as the aggressor or the ones that are constantly subjecting them to certain forms of domination. We are talking about the ways in which women themselves are formed within such a matrix. In other words, women understand their positions to be inherently unequal and therefore do not see it as unequal. If this is what we have been given or allowed, if these are the boundaries within which we are allowed to succeed or flourish in society, then those boundaries become our home and we are most comfortable in them. Not only are we most comfortable within those boundaries, we also prevent others from breaking their boundaries, and this goes under the name of internalized sexism. Now remember, this concept is important because it does not accord blame one way or the other. We are functioning only through a structural analysis that produces certain things in us as if they were natural. Our thoughts, our feelings, our opinions. Despite the kind of emphasis that current society has on free individuals, structural thinking encourages us to remember that how we are formed depends on the ways in which we are educated, brought up, acculturated. In short, on the discourses floating around in society that we internalize as truth. Right? Think about it as being constantly in a fake news world. How would you know the difference between fake and otherwise? And therefore, feminist theory suggests sisterhood as an antidote to internalized sexism, which otherwise would constantly pit women in competition against one another. So, if men have possibilities of male bonding, where they connect with one another, support one another, have one another's backs, then we need sisterhood, right? And sisterhood allows us then to be braver because we are brave together. In this, Bell Hooks also refers to her book, Ain't I a Woman? Black Women and Feminism. Here there's a particular kind of sisterhood that is also modeled on a dual experience of being both woman and of being black. And the ways in which sisterhood between white women and African American women was a difficult proposition because they were held apart by this understanding that white women's needs are universal needs and black women's needs are racial needs, and therefore they cannot be spoken about in the same breath together. In this title, she invokes another important figure in American history called Sojourner Truth, who delivered a speech called Ain't I a Woman at the Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio, making a plea for inclusion as a black woman, not just as any kind of woman, saying, ain't I a woman too? Isn't blackness something that should be acknowledged in my effort to put my questions and concerns and needs at the heart of the feminist movement? I want to give you a little glimpse of that speech, so let's just read a little excerpt. I want to say a few words about this matter. I am a woman's rights. I have as much muscle as any man and can do as much work as any man. I have plowed and reaped and husked and chopped and mowed, and can any man do more than that? I have heard much about the sexes being equal. I can carry as much as any man and can eat as much too if I can get it. I am as strong as any man that is now. As for intellect, all I can say is, if a woman can have a pint and a man a quart, why can't she have her little pint full? You need not be afraid to give us our rights for fear that we will take too much, for we can't take more than our pint will hold. This is Sojourner Truth on the frame. And pay attention to what she's saying in order to understand what I referred to earlier in relation to white women. Truth is saying I have as much muscle as any man, can do as much work as any man. She is referring here to the plight of the African American woman worker, the kind who are not privy to the kinds of privileges that, say, white women may have had, and that's a separate kind of discussion for the ways in which it confined American white women to the space of the home. But this means naturally that the kinds of rights that African American women would ask for would be different than the white woman. And this carries forth in any kind of scenario where we are discussing a community of women, where differences must be accommodated and included in order to make the movement stronger. The next chapter is on feminist education for critical consciousness. And here we see Hooks moving towards the argument that the feminist movement also created a feminist education that was necessary in order to produce a larger understanding of what it means to interrupt and change patriarchal society. Such an education then demanded necessarily that there be literature produced about the feminist movement, about issues and about feminist thinking that could then work to understand what are the ways in which women are absent from public intellectual production. So women's studies, for example, which arose out of such feminist thinking in the 1960s and 1970s as a university-based educational formation, was not about trashing work by men. It wasn't asking necessarily to begin with that where are the women in men's work. They were asking where are the women. What is it that we are writing and reading, and how does such reading and writing adequately or inadequately speak about women's presence and experiences in the world? For example, they were looking at the ways in which literature perpetuates gender stereotypes or the ways in which it invisibilizes women. That the hero is always the one moving the plot forward, or the largest interventions in society are always brought forth by men. So this was very, very important in arguing for a feminist education. Think about it seriously. Can any movement succeed if it does not parallelly also produce a certain amount of literary production on the figures we are speaking about? Because in a literate society, this is the way in which you can bring about large-scale change and make sure it's not just rooted in the location where the feminist activist speaks and holds forth. Let me give you a quick example of a book that is currently available on Amazon called Good Night Stories for Rebel Girls. Now, fairy tales, if you read the work of other theorists, have long been argued for a site where society perpetuates its gender stereotypes. The prince is handsome and brave, the princess is a victim, sleeping, waiting to be rescued, shut away in a castle, and when there is a meeting of the prince and the princess, that's when happiness abounds because the rescuer has come to release her. In Good Night Stories for Rebel Girls, writers and illustrators come together to write the stories of important, famous, rebellious women in society and give them a little bit of a twist by speaking about them in the same tone as fairy tales do. So you imitate the tone of the story, you produce beautiful illustrations in the same manner as a fairy tale book, but these are about women and these are about independent, strong, intrepid women in society. So let me read you a little bit of an excerpt from one of these, which is an Ada Lovelace. Once upon a time, there was a girl named Ada, who loved machines. She also loved the idea of flying. She studied birds to work out the perfect balance between wing size and body weight. She tested out materials, tried out several designs. She never managed to soar like a bird, but she created a beautiful book full of drawings called Flyology, where she recorded all of her findings. One night, Ada went to a ball. There she met a grumpy old mathematician named Charles Babbage. Ada was a brilliant mathematician herself, and the two soon became good friends. Charles invited Ada to see a machine he had invented. He called it the difference engine. It could automatically add and subtract numbers. No one had ever done that before. Ada was hooked. What if he built a machine that could make more complicated calculations, she said. Excited, Ada and Charles started working. The machine was huge and it required an enormous steam engine. Ada wanted to go further. What if this machine could play music and show letters as well as numbers? She was describing a computer way before modern computers were invented. Ada wrote the first computer program in history. December 10th, 1815 to November 27th, 1852, United Kingdom. And here is a beautiful illustration then of Ada Lovelace as well to accompany the text. Look how interesting such a rewriting can be in relation to feminist theory and the women's movement. Think about the ways in which this text upends the convention of fairy tales. Starts with the very familiar once upon a time, there was a girl named Ada. And then the rest of it changes, who loved machines. Now, this is not something you expect the heroine of a fairy tale to love, machines, right? And then it goes on to really delve into the ways in which Ada is a full person. Also notice, she went to a ball. Now, what do you expect the moment you see ball or a party? You expect that she's going to meet some handsome person, she's going to fall in love, and that's the end of it. Instead, she meets a grumpy old mathematician named Charles Babbage, who of course is very familiar in the understanding of scientific history, right? But then it goes on to say she was a brilliant mathematician herself. She has an identity of her own. She can hold her own in relation to Babbage. And lo and behold, it doesn't say they fell in love. It says, excited, Ada and Charles started working, that she is an independent entity who wants to pursue her passion. Remember bell hooks' passionate politics? This is about the ways in which a figure who is somebody passionate about science and machines can also produce something in collaboration with a man instead of being subject to his rescuing tendencies. Therefore, goodnight stories for rebel girls, but not rebelling in the sense of upending all conventions of society, but rebelling in the sense of the ways in which one can understand how to be a woman, and it need not necessarily stick to conventional fairy tale understandings. I'd also like to bring your attention to work like the lifeofscience.com, a science media platform focused on science within society in India, which took shape in 2016 as a project of two freelance science writers, Ashima Dogra and Nandita Jayaraj. I would encourage that you follow their work. It chronicles biographies of women scientists that they met while hopping across laboratories and research institutions in India. Now, why are such visibility projects important? Because they provide very, very important role models as we go about the business of education. If while growing up we only read about famous men and not famous women, then I suppose our ambitions can only be restricted to having romantic or otherwise relations with such men as opposed to becoming them ourselves. And therefore, in women's studies, in such endeavors, visibility is not a token project. It is important to forge a path for people in society to find different ways of being gender, different ways of being men and women in society. The next chapter, Our Bodies, Ourselves, also connects to one of the later chapters called the Feminist Sexual Politic, which deals with the question of women's sexuality. Now, please remember that women's sexuality is not merely about the freedom to have sex or not have sex or to have sexual relations. It is the freedom of sexual choice with whom and when, meaning in your choice of partner and your choice of when is it that you are ready to have such form of sexuality in the world. It allows for people's differential understanding of self. Also related is the question of pregnancy, or what in the feminist theory pantheon are called reproductive rights. The question of reproductive rights, of course, has to do with sexuality, pregnancy, whether to reproduce or not, what time of life, at what stage, in what fashion, and reproductive rights encapsulates it better because otherwise we get caught in the binary political question of abortion versus anti-abortion or right to life campaigns, as they call them across the world, where women's bodies are pitted against the rights of the unborn child. In this understanding, Reproductive rights means women should have control over the ways in which their bodies can or cannot be taken over. This has to be a way that is negotiated with the woman herself instead of dictated by spouse or society or religion or what have you. Now remember that these are controversial questions. They are by no means simple, and we will return to them later on in this series of lectures in order to understand its complicated location in society and culture. Last point. We understand women's bodies and women as deserving of rights and value, whether or not subject to men's desire. Now, I will continue with this point in relation to the next chapter, but remember this, that often women are taught that they only matter in society if they are desired by men, and if not appropriate objects of desire, they are invisible and not worthy of attention. And such desire need not be sexual only. It could be desirability vis-a-vis being an appropriate woman in the family, a proper scientist, a good worker, always seeking men's validation and men's approval. And this is something that our bodies ourselves emphasizes, that one need not have value in the world only in relation to men. To continue, in the chapter Beauty Within and Without, we are dealing with a very, very important conception, especially in relation to women, the definition of beauty itself. What counts as beautiful? Who is beautiful in a society? What are the ways in which the body is broken down into its component parts in order for a woman to consider herself beautiful or worthy? And in this, Hooks is confronting sexist thinking about the female body, also related to male desire. Hooks encourages us to think about self-esteem and self-love without approval from the outside, to think about feminist thinking in relation to beauty as producing varied paradigms of beauty that need not conform to one set of standards. And one can see in society why this is a very, very difficult set of interventions. Starting from beauty pageants to the ways in which families comment upon girls and women and the ways in which they consider desirable for things like marriage or love, you are combating such sexist thinking about women's bodies at all fronts. And therefore, the chapter encourages you to pay attention to concepts like body shaming, to ideal body types, the ways in which choices of clothing also shape the perceptions of women in society. In other words, what are the multiple ways in which this idea of beauty is produced as a norm, right? The idea of a norm is very, very important to feminist thinking because norms are also produced within patriarchal society. They are not innocent. They do not come out of nowhere, and they are meant also to pit women against one another in the hope that we can forever maintain this idea wherein women compete with one another for men's attention. In relation to this chapter, perhaps try this exercise. If you see 5 new people in a day, think about who is it that you consider beautiful. What do these beautiful people have in common? Can you break their bodies down? Skin tone, height, hair, body proportions. And I would encourage that you do this not just for women but also for men. It's not that men can escape these characterizations. Perhaps one can only go so far to say that men can compensate for lack of conventional beauty through other things, money for example. Think about the standard trope where an older, not so good looking rich man is with a younger, much more beautiful woman, where the woman is called a gold digger, but the man is considered to be quite smart for having bagged a younger, beautiful woman. Think about these dynamics in society and the ways in which they encourage these characterizations of ideal body types. Think about who your favorite public figures are and why they are your favorite. Think also about the ways in which conventional beauty offers advantages to both men and women. Now remember, the last is particularly important because conforming to society's norms gets you rewards in society, because this is the only way that the patriarchal structure perpetuates itself. So if you happen to conform to normal beauty standards, you will gain rewards more than the person who does not. And therefore, you will be encouraged to perpetuate those standards by saying, I made it. What prevents somebody else from making it, without realizing that these norms and your accidental conformity with them is what allows you to make it. In the next chapter, Hooks addresses an important aspect of feminist struggle, namely class. And in her understanding, class is much more than Marx's definition of people's relations to the means of production. Depending on whether you own them or whether you are a wage laborer, you have a different socioeconomic class. But Hooks rightly points out that class is also about behavior, habits, and preferences. And therefore, feminist empowerment cannot be realized unless we bring about a movement across classes that is not restricted to the middle class or to the upper class. And this is fairly obvious if you look at the daily news around you. The only kinds of atrocities very often that gain attention are those perpetuated upon the bodies of middle or upper class women. Often, lower class women's bodies are considered to be negligible, unimportant, or disposable. And this is what she is addressing, specifically in relation to things like widening gaps between the rich and the poor, which means that the kinds of atrocities that are suffered by lower class men will be doubly suffered by lower class women, gesturing to concepts such as the feminization of poverty, which refers to the ways in which as people suffer more and more poverty, the ones suffering the most are lower class women. And therefore, feminist struggles cannot be spoken about unless we speak about them in relation to class differences. Moving on from such class struggle, this is an important chapter speaking about global feminism, meaning where is that feminism comes from. In this class, we are speaking about it in relation to the global north or Europe, but there are other kinds of feminisms as well that may not have supporting literature in English. In this class, we are going to come to Indian feminism, its location and its context soon enough. But Hooks is asking, what about the relationship between feminism and decolonization? Now, feminism, since it's located currently in the global north, must also acknowledge its relationship with former colonial struggles, meaning feminism cannot ignore the fact that the countries within which it takes root were also responsible for imperial domination over countries of the global south. And therefore, there cannot be a universalizing tendency for feminism without also taking into account decolonization struggles. For example, think about Gayatri Spivak's really interesting saying where she calls it white men saving brown women from brown men in relation to the ways in which imperial powers of the global north continue to want to save women in the barbaric south where their men perpetuate atrocities upon them. And in this, she says feminism must call out imperial ambition at the same time as they call out the goals of the feminist movement. And therefore, Hooks is calling for a transnational feminism, one which acknowledges the differences brought about in post-coloniality. The chapter on women at work is interested in the ways in which feminism also advocates economic self-sufficiency. Now, this is something that is hotly contested. Often it depends on the kinds of work available to women as to whether they offer liberatory potential or not. But universally, there seems to be some sort of agreement that women who have access to money on their own by virtue of their own forms of work have the capacity to liberate themselves better than women who don't. There are complications to this thesis. We are not particularly sure how this works. Women could be working, but the men at home could be the ones having access to their monies. Women could be working, be paid unequally. Women could be exploited by forms of work. So all of these scenarios have to be considered before we understand work as a common liberatory possibility. But we'll come to that in this course in relation to the week where we discuss feminism and work. But women at work is important also in its understanding of the ways in which working women are able to traverse both private and public. Women at Work, the chapter is important in its understanding that the divide between public and private, which is necessary to be able to confine women, can be broken down through the act of working. And this is something important to pay attention to. We come now to the chapter on race and gender, where I've included another category which is important to us, that of caste. Here the question is for the feminist movement itself, meaning, can we accommodate differences based on race, caste, in addition to gender, or will that distract from our goals? And Hook's answer is fairly simple. She says one cannot have a feminist movement without understanding it intersectionally. Now, intersection is useful. If we think about something as a point on an axis, it is produced not just through one kind of difference, gender, but also through race, but also through caste. And therefore, it is at the intersection of these three forms of identity that one can begin to apprehend the individual. And to Hookes, intersectional feminism is paramount in the feminist movement's goals. From here, Hookes moves on to a chapter speaking about ending violence. And the heart of the matter in this chapter is patriarchal violence, defined by her as the allowance of force to control others. This might seem fairly commonsensical. The fact that society is ordered through the survival of the fittest, like people like to misquote Darwin, and in the survival of the fittest, those that are strongest win. What it also assumes is that the strongest must display their strength in order to dominate others, in order to survive. Societies everywhere seem to want to perpetuate this understanding by saying that dominance is necessary for people to know who's boss. So be it at work, home, or on the street, aggression and violence is the way to be in order to survive in everyday life. To Hookes, this is a problem, and she sees enunciations of that everywhere you look, such as in terms like domestic violence, which seems so innocent. Violence in a domestic space. To her, domestic violence means that women will be subject to it over and over again within the confines of a private space where such violence cannot be addressed. 1. 2. It's not that women are not violent. Do women not commit violence? Absolutely do. And in many ways, where she identifies such forms of violence is again within the home space where women discipline children, where the child is subject to such form of disciplining under the guise of care, under the guise of parental care, wherein violence is the way that men and women dominate children. And therefore, is there a way to end such a form of violence? In order to understand this, she then addresses something that she calls feminist masculinity. In other words, if ending violence means that we should stop allowing people to think about force as being needed to control others, perhaps we also need to be able to understand men differently. And in a feminist masculinity, you allow for the subjectivity of a man to be shaped by things other than force and dominance, to be shaped by self-esteem and self-love that is not related to how much force they can exert upon other people around them. And therefore, feminist masculinity is used to counter reactions such as the men's liberation movement, which were responses to negative portrayals of men in the feminist movement. And in many ways, this is a tricky situation, because what the feminist movement is critiquing is actually patriarchal violence and the tendency to patriarchy, often in men. But when you collapse the two, and when it begins to seem as if men are the cause and not patriarchal structures that produce men in particular fashion, then of course you give rise to things like men's liberation, which are anti-women or anti-feminists. Instead, such a vision of feminist masculinity allows us to understand that patriarchy subjects everybody to violence, producing masculine men and feminine women. An example of work of such feminist masculinity could be things like the Forum to Engage Men an informal network of individuals and organizations with the primary objective of working with boys and men to make them responsible for a gender-just and equitable society. And what they want to do is make interventions in the area of masculinities for bringing about meaningful and durable changes in our fields of endeavor. And here it's really interesting to me that they've chosen men and boys as their target audience by saying that the feminist movement needs to bring about change in all of society and not just women vis-a-vis men. From ending violence and feminist masculinity, we move on to feminist parenting that builds upon an earlier concept which speaks about how societies are based on autocratic rule over children. We consider children to have no civil rights. They are shamed, they are taught things top down, they are expected to listen, they are expected to not have any kind of sensibility at all unless shaped by parental care. And in this, Hooks is concerned with raising children in an anti-sexist environment. Raising children in an anti-sexist environment, and she says, well, if they are subject to violence in the very act of parenting, how will they learn otherwise? Now this chapter, as in when I've taught it before, has always been controversial because often I teach students who are between 18 to 20 years of age, and they think about parenting as an environment in which force must be allowed, because otherwise how will children listen? Children are wayward, children are wild, they don't understand, they infantilize children, right? And while that might seem slightly counterintuitive, children are infants, Hooks' understanding is that only through love, only through collaborative parenting, only through mutual understanding can children understand non-sexist behavior, non-autocratic behavior, non-forceful behavior, and continue to behave that way in their own lives as they grow up. So therefore, to her, feminist parenting also involves dismantling the assumptions of patriarchal behavior within the family by both men and women, and giving children the capacity to understand the world in less violent ways. From there, Hooks moves on to the question of marriage and partnership, and this is a difficult one. So I'm going to throw it open to you all listening, and I'm going to ask you to think about the structure of marriage within society. What are the kinds of marriages? What are the roles that it plays? What are the roles of partnership? In this, I mean partnership in the same ways that I mean marriage, because there are different forms of contractual arrangements. What makes for an equal marriage? Is it a bit of an oxymoron? What is the status of marriage and divorce in a society? What is the status of those who are single and non-partnered? And if you are able to ponder these questions, then what Hooks is talking about will become clearer to you in saying that structures in society are undergirded by patriarchal assumptions. And this forms the bulk of the book. So for later lectures, we'll look at lesbianism and feminism, and this comes in the weeks where we discuss queer theory. We'll talk about love, we'll talk about spirituality and visionary feminism. And these chapters you should read through in any case, but we will unpack them for later lectures along with examples so that you're able to understand what Hooks' project in the world is in relation to passionate politics. For our last lecture for this week, which is coming up right after this, we'll try and read select passages from the book that illustrate these concepts, and also so you can get an idea of how to read going forward. As you're reading, please note down interesting concepts and try and read them in tandem with the newspaper or your daily headlines. Now, if you're able to do the last, then you will begin to see concepts illuminated in the world, and only then will they make sense to you. So this is an exercise I will recommend for the rest of this course. So until next lecture, when we read from the book, please go over all of these concepts and try and read from the book yourself, and we will try and deepen your practice with our last lecture for week 1. Thank you.